Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Coach Kassem Hanson from N1. And today we're talking all about social media, actually, for quite a big chunk of time. What is Kassem's current approach to social media? What does he see with the problems on social media in regards to people regurgitating information, science-based lifting becoming kind of something that's looked down upon because people are misusing science to get more clicks and engagement with their content? And how can we kind of battle that? Where does wisdom come in? How important is it to learn from those who have been doing this for a long period of time? We kind of dive into that. What bodybuilders are doing right now that science hasn't confirmed that is leading to effective results, but is clearly working for them. I discussed that in the context of, hey, when we were looking at bodybuilders, they were using momentum during their pulling motions, and that was helping to complement the resistance profile for lots of back training so that they can get that back musculature closer to failure. We dive into that a little bit more. There's some fantastic discussion from Kassem. He brings a lot of nuance. And we dive into some of the debates that he's been having on his own podcast with various kind of people across social media, the nuances of dead guy anatomy. How useful is it to use a skeleton and have bands on there? What does it really tell us? What are the limitations of that? And then talking about chest training. Is it important to kind of retract the scapula and have an arch, or is that a problem? Where should our rib cage be? Talking about some of the nuances with chest training. And I think you guys are going to really enjoy this episode. As always, if you do enjoy these, let us know. Give us a thumbs up, give us a like, give us a subscribe. And as a reminder, we are affiliated with the Mass Research Review. If you know Eric Helms, Eric Trexler, the team over there, they are looking at the latest science within hypertrophy training, strength training, and they're giving you the take homes. If you're a coach, it's great for education. I visit it regularly when I'm looking for resources and also to drive content and also to educate myself and clients. But if you just love this stuff, if you like these sort of discussions, you'll love the Mass Research Review. So that's linked in the description as well. Like I said, we're an affiliate, so by signing up, you're not just helping yourself, helping the Mass Research Review, you're also helping us Revive Stronger so we can keep making great content like this. But guys, without further ado, let's get into the chat with Coach Kassem. Kassem, this question actually came up because I was listening to your own podcast, which I do highly recommend people check out. I know you've been putting quite a lot of time and effort into that of late. I was literally just listening to you just now, kind of talking to someone and interviewing them. And this question is basically, you've been in the fitness industry, I don't actually know how long, but over a decade, am I correct? Close to 2?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think
more than
2 at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's when people ask me, how long have I been training? I was like, yeah, over a decade. And it's like, oh, actually, it's basically 2 decades now. It's kind of longer than like it's more than half my life. It's kind of crazy. So you're an old dog when you get into that point. And obviously you've seen kind of trends come and go and they recycle. And I know when I first got into the industry a decade ago, for me, I heard people say it, but I was like, yeah, whatever, like whatever, old dude, like cool. Whereas now I'm like, yeah, you really do see it come and go. Is there anything recently that comes to mind where you feel like people have been too far in one direction, whether that's like just poo-pooing it and being like, nah, don't need to worry about that, or leaning too far into it and being like, yeah, I'm just going to go head first into this new trend?
I think there's a big push on kind of a minimalist training methodology, maybe kind of an over focus on avoiding fatigue, like kind of that kind of narrative thing that's been going around where it's just people trying to stack every possible variable, that they can to avoid like any fatigue. For example, you have people doing, well, I want to do low volume, but then I am also going to be avoiding lengthened positions or higher reps and stuff. And the irony is that if you're doing low volume, you're probably the person that needs to be the least concerned about other, we'll say, training variables that contribute to fatigue, because you're just not doing enough volume for it to matter in the first place. But for whatever reason, that's probably, I think, the biggest trend that I've seen where people just are taking that way too far. And it's hard to tell how much of it is rage bait and not because it started where people were like, hey, if you do, if you do more than 8 reps, you're an imbecile. And now you have people literally making videos of like, it's like, oh, I do 2 reps with one RIR, 2 sets of that, and that's like my training session. I'm like, okay, this has went way probably too far to the minimalist approach to training.
Yes, that whole it's fake news, isn't it? All over again. Like it's hard to know what's real and what's not if people are just trying to like bait you. I hadn't heard of rage bait until I don't know. I heard someone talking about it. I actually recently commented it on Ben Yanes did a reaction to someone doing it's like a wide grip lat pull down and they cuff their elbows and cuff the bar and they were just like pulling down like here and basically saying it's like quote unquote optimal. And I was like, surely they're doing that as rage bait, but his argument is like, how do you know? And I can see where he's coming from. Like, still break it down to make sure people understand. Because unfortunately, when you're in the know, you kind of can pick it apart. I think, but when you're outside just looking in, and you're like, hey, I'm just getting into the fitness industry. I can't tell what's rage bait and what's not.
Yeah, I don't know a lot of the time. And what's funny is sometimes the people that are making some of the rage bait content, it's not too dissimilar from their regular content, which makes it very hard to tell the difference between the two. Like if somebody makes content that is very different than their normal thing as kind of a joke, you can pick up on that. But if it's only like 5% different than your normal content, it's like, how do I know this? How do I know when you're no longer being serious? Because it's right at the edge,
And I didn't really want to make this into a social media discussion, but it kind of goes down that route just because that's where a lot of, I guess, that's where you see the trends nowadays. Like that's where it's not so much you see it in the gym, you see it like people posting their videos online. And yeah, this is one of the issues I see cropping up all the time is people leaning into that and kind of putting people down the wrong rabbit hole, but they get rewarded. This is what I was trying to say. Yeah, there's an account, I can't think of what it is, but he's a bodybuilder, and basically he just contradicts himself throughout his reels. He'll be like 10,000 calorie cheat day, he's eating all this junk food, and then the next post will be like, I prefer to smoke a cigarette than eat McDonald's because McDonald's is worse for you for all these reasons. It's just like, wow, it's just, I think it's a lot of teenagers or young 20-year-olds who maybe aren't, I don't know, we're in our 30s, 40s, we're a bit past doing that sort of content, I think, a lot of the time, where they're just like, okay, social media is rewarding this, I'm just going to post this, and they're not thinking about that. They're not trying to actually post it for their audience's sake. They're trying to just see what's being rewarded. Let's go down that rabbit hole. Is that something you're seeing a lot of as well?
Yeah, especially I think as we'll say the entry level of fitness has gotten younger and younger, and you have those people coming in and they're on these platforms where they get less context, they have less of attention span, etc. You've just seen the way people speak and the content they make just really get diluted by the algorithm to where now, I mean, it's just very different than the way that or the environment that I went into when I got interested in this. Like everything was very long form and you had to work to find information, whereas now everything is thrown at you and it's only meant to like capture your attention for, a very short period of time and to try and we'll say get you to think a certain way in the least amount of time. And then that's it. Like there's no like, hey, maybe you should question this or here's some nuance. It's just like, here's a flashy thing. Cool. You want another one? You want another one? You want another one? How high can we get that dopamine? You know?
Yeah, no nuance or context is going to be enjoyed there. It's literally they want either a positive or negative reaction, which is clearly like that content. It's going to be people are like, oh yeah, of course, like I'm completely pro clean eating, whatever that is, and like minimally processed food, and he's completely right. And then there's other people who are just like they understand, I don't know, flexible dieting, moderation, all of this. They're going to hate against it, and so it's just piling up the views and the clicks there. Have you ever got caught up in that? Like, have you ever found yourself leaning too far into algorithm? And if you have, where have you moved to? What's your kind of, do you have a social media strategy per se at the moment?
I would say occasionally I do, but I tend to really dislike the things that the algorithm wants. They're averse to the way that I like to communicate, and what interests me. Cause like I'm interested in nuance. Like I'm not interested in discussions like, oh, what's better, free weights or machines? Like that, like those conversations don't really interest me. Surface level, like conversations on topics don't really interest me. And I think, there's plenty of other people that can have those conversations in the industry. A lot of people will be like, well, why don't you like dumb this down to whatever? And I'm like, there's a gazillion people that can speak about this on a very simple level. I'm trying to have a conversation that's up here. And so that kind of just naturally selects me away from being able to participate in super viral content. Probably the most viral thing is occasionally when I have a disagreement with another high profile person or debate or whatever. Sometimes those things can, we'll say, go longer than what their utility is. And I think a lot of that too is that a lot of people just have, we'll say, very inflexible positions and don't really understand the topics that they're talking about like enough to have actual debates. So they just kind of repeat talking points over and over and over again, which it ends up not really being discourse in a lot of these situations. It ends up being like, okay, here's some evidence. And then you have another person that'll just like, well, I'm just going to repeat my talking points rather than address the evidence. And so then I kind of get caught up in like, well, do I just continue telling the story about this topic, as a, like, it's just like, as a narrative from my perspective, even though I'm not having the other side of the conversation isn't really following me. And so I do that sometimes. And then like the recent one was the debate I had with lats. It's like, okay, how far down the rabbit hole do I cover this topic? I mean, do I basically get to almost the level that I would teach this at a seminar so that people can really understand this? Or do I teach just enough so that certain people will be able to understand my position in the debate? And so sometimes I get carried away, I think, in terms of like, hey, why don't I just leave no doubt and kind of give people all of the information? And people just don't have the attention span for that. But because there's, we'll say, some inherent drama around it, those things tend to, we'll say, you just get more comments on those posts, but they're not exactly on topic. A lot of times they're about the person or the interaction. But engagement's engagement. So if that's a way of me getting, we'll say, a little bit of nuance in front of more people, I'm kind of like, okay, cool. I will leverage the personal element here that people are interested in to try and get this information out. I just don't know necessarily where the line is of like, okay, are people reading the 20 slides that I posted, or are people like seeing the first two and then using that as an excuse to then just kind of comment on the happenings of the debate,
Yeah, I think that's very astute of you to recognize that that could very well be what the majority of people are doing, because I have a feeling that it does go that way as well. And I also appreciate that, and that's content I've tried, is that reaction content. And I always feel a bit uncomfortable doing it, even when I'm trying to position it just like you do. You don't attack the person at all. You don't attack, but you kind of critique their position. You don't critique them as an individual, which I think is fantastic. And that's definitely the right way to go about it. But people always like to draw in the personal attacks. And unfortunately, that drama element, the kind of that social media element of things gets more attention. I know my most viral piece of content, not that it was particularly viral, but it was basically Dr. Mike was doing an exercise and I was like, I'm going to try Dr. Mike's exercise. I tried it and I gave my thoughts on it. And then suddenly it was just people hadn't seen that exercise before and Dr. Mike was in it. So it was like, hey, Dr. Mike's like a big personality, loads of followers. And then it looked a bit weird. So then people are automatically already giving opinions and assumptions on various things within there. And I'm like, I actually don't know if that helps me in any way, shape or form. Like it gets more eyes on the account, maybe, then they look at some other bits and pieces. But I think something else you identified there was, and something I really appreciate about you, Kassem, is you're willing to basically debate anyone on topics that are within your wheelhouse, which I think just says a lot about how well you know your stuff. And I think it's very telling if you see someone, maybe a big social media following, but then they haven't got any long form content, because I'm kind of like, well, I know how easy it is just to script and edit and do jump cuts to make it look like you know something in a short period of time. But if you've never spoken about it at length anywhere, especially with someone, then how much do you really know about it versus, like you just said, like you're just parroting off information that sounds good?
Yeah, and it's a totally different experience to know a topic to where you can actually converse about it, like you can be asked questions and answer them, versus saying, "Oh, here's a topic that I want to cover in a post, and I can pull enough, enough of a script from either other content or information that I can give the presence that I understand this, or give the, we'll say, the view that I understand this, but you don't really understand it well, where if somebody interrupts your script, that you can actually deviate and talk about the principles and actually discuss the topic back and forth outside of that script, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the interesting things when I've started kind of like trying to have debates with certain people is, some of those people are self-aware and they know that like I can make content, but I couldn't actually have a conversation on these topics. Um, and I think it's it's weird because you don't want to be a bully in this space of like, yeah, let's have a debate so that I can show you don't know what you need. But also it's like, well, if you're that aware, you should at least be open to listening to the other perspectives if you're aware enough that you don't understand it. But what tends to happen is people just double down, or they're insecure about it, and so that's when they resort to the ad hominems and all sorts of stuff. It's just unfortunate that there's not more good dance partners, to have, like, because I think, with reaction type content, if you have somebody that you can kind of have banter with in a back and forth, you can mutually benefit each other and each other's audience. But there's just so few people that can be like, yeah, we can have a good intentioned conversation, and we can even like, we can throw some jokes and humor in our posts and stuff and not take it personal like that. I think, that's the ideal for these scenarios. But there's like maybe three people so far that I've come across with where it's like, hey, we can have an honest debate, and we can even poke fun at each other's content and stuff, and like not like an insulting way, but it's just like, yeah, cool. You want to make a funny meme or some funny music or whatever into a post or something, like, okay, cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that. I can definitely see how that's ideal. I think they try and do that a little bit in on the enhanced side of bodybuilding, where you'll have some competitors who will like take jabs at one another, and they know it's nothing like serious, but from the outside in, everyone's like, oh, they hate each other, so on and so forth. I know there was a time we actually used this to our advantage a little bit. We were running a seminar that didn't end up going ahead because of COVID, but it was with Eric Helms and Dr. Mike. And there was a time where people were literally putting them against one another. And I think for a period of time, both of them weren't particularly kind of keen on that. And then they came to an understanding, I think, where they're like, actually, this is fine. Like, we get on, we understand each other's position, we don't dislike each other, we actually like get on. And so if it just grows the kind of the awareness of our positions and kind of the space of the evidence-based space, then let's lean into that. But yeah, unfortunately, that never went ahead. And actually, this is a question I had for you, which I thought was really interesting, that you were bringing, I don't know, you were putting yourself in positions to have these debates and discussions. Again, I respect you highly for that. I just wondered if there was anything you took from those discussions, if anything stands out from the people you've had on your podcast or when you've gone on others, specifically with these kind of younger social media influencers, if there's anything you've taken away from those as like, that's a key point I'm going to take moving forward, even if it's just, I don't know, their approach to social media.
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of the like debates directly, like, I never want to say no to debate, but I think I've actually got to the point where like, all right, there's certain formats where maybe I'll say like, yeah, that won't be productive. It's very easy to weaponize like a time restriction or something like that. And when we're talking about nuanced things, it's like you need to be able to kind of go point by point and have a discussion like that, rather than say, let me talk for a whole bunch of time and then the other person is scrambling to try and remember everything that I said and respond to that and also give their point perspective. You see in like politics and stuff like that, where time is weaponized, because all you got to do is like say something bad about the other person or make some ridiculous claim, and then they have to spend the majority of their time just trying to address that one thing that you said. In terms of discussing with some of the younger people, and like, I'm not really looking at those things as debates. Like, I'm genuinely curious kind of how people are getting to where they are now, because it's a totally different world than when I jumped in and started my learning or education journey. So I'm just interested in, in how are these people finding their information? Why are they choosing that? What is their perspective on kind of how they view their own content? And I think that's kind of interesting because, there's some of these people get a ton of backlash. Like there's kind of like this like movement of like, kind of dunking on these young kids that are making quote unquote science-based content and stuff now. And I'm just kind of curious, like, it's like, do you reflect that, or do you like, does that make you want to double down, et cetera? And I'm just trying to understand that so that I can kind of leverage my content and actually just these conversations to how do we kind of help this generation out a little bit more? Because it makes me sad kind of seeing the youth or the novices in the fitness industry and kind of we'll say the gauntlet that they have to go through before they can eventually kind of get a hold on reality in this industry and start actually kind of being able to put things into perspective. I think right now there's just everybody wants to they want to start and they immediately want to be at the success and influence of people that have been doing it for a lot longer. And that includes not just from a knowledge perspective, but they want to speak and act like they've put in the gym time that they haven't either, and there's a lot of pushback, I think, right now, like at least in my feed of like, okay, for all of those, I see as many posts basically that are just reactions to those things. And I don't know that we're going to change any of that behavior for the better if all we do is just point out how bad it is and call these kids small and skinny and, dumb or whatever. So it's like, well, how do I potentially nudge them onto a little bit better path? How do I get them to be a little bit more thoughtful, or maybe consider some sources, or doing a little bit of their own work rather than just trusting the top 5 people that they follow on TikTok or whatever it is, right? So I wouldn't say that those are debates, but I have learned that, the incentives at that level are a big obstacle, right? Like what people want. Like when I started, I just wanted to know stuff for my own training. Like it had nothing to do with, I want to create a profile, I want to share stuff, etc. Like my initial journey was completely selfish. All I wanted to do was know as much as I could so that I could be better. Like I initially wanted to do this so that I could be, bigger and stronger for football. Like that's how I got into this, right? And that carried through all the way through my college year. So even like I'm reading research studies, and really what I want to know is like, all right, is this going to help me, push the other guy across the line a little bit better if I put this into practice. And then you get into the physique world and stuff like that. But it's these guys now they're wanting to make content for others after they've just started training. And I mean, I didn't really start making content on social media until 2017, 18, so I had but I started training, like actually coaching. So we'll use that since social media not existing isn't really a fair time frame. But, I probably had been in the field in some way, shape, or form for over 5 years before I ever was in any position to want to tell other people how to do it or what to do. And now it's like there's this rush of as soon as I do something, I want to tell other people to do that thing like 5 seconds after I've done it. Sometimes if I've even done it at all, maybe I just, secondhand, I saw somebody else do or say something, and now I'm going to make content about that and tell other people this is the way to do it, having not actually even given any time to do it myself. And they get the likes, the engagement and stuff off of that without actually ever having to do it. And for me, the quote unquote, the equivalent of the engagement was the process of actually trying the stuff out, like applying the scientific method. Like, okay, cool. I learned this thing. this is going into a meso and I'm going to try this thing out. Like that was the dopamine hit, was actually trying to learn things and doing them. And now it seems the dopamine hit is like, I just learn things so that I can talk about them because I'm not actually going to take the time to apply them before I talk about them. And so there's, I don't know, the incentive process is so different now than, when I started training.
Yeah, it makes me reflect upon when I first got into social media, and immediately when I think about that, I was mirroring others who were in the space that I wanted to be in. So I remember mirroring Matt Ogus was the immediate example that comes to mind, and all he would do is share his bodybuilding journey, and like he'd interview Eric Helms, his coach at the time, and ask him questions. He was just very curious and shared his journey. He wasn't trying to like sound the smartest or educate the masses in any sort of way. And that's very much how I started. And then I started to share what I learned. And it never came from a place of like, trying to tell people they're doing it right or wrong. And also at that time, online coaching wasn't such a big thing. Whereas I think, because you're kind of mentioning the incentives, I think a lot of the younger generation are now looking at some people who are doing online coaching and, I don't know, earning good money and being flexible, or then they're like, wow, that's the route I want to go down, or I want to be an influencer. The number of kids that maybe want to be influencers has just massively grown. So yeah, now it's kind of taken away from what I enjoyed social media for initially, which was just like sharing and being social, whereas now it's become very much like a marketing tool. And that's what actually similar to what's happened with science, where I think when I was getting into it and learning about like evidence-based practice, coming across Lyle McDonald, Alan Aragon, kind of two of my early influences, it it was just great learning. Whereas now it's like people are taking small bits of information from various people, like you said, and just parroting them, and they're using it as just like, how great does this sound? How great am I know so much. And it gets the clicks. And yeah, it's certainly hard to get people captured and bring them into long format conversations, or even being like, hey, I'm also self-aware enough to know podcasts aren't the best education tool at all. Like, go do courses, do N1's course, do an actual kind of qualification, read textbooks. Don't rely on social media for your education.
Yeah, it just astounds me that there are so many people that are now online coaches that have 1 or 2 years of actual training experience themselves, right? Like that's just so weird. I can't imagine hiring me after 2 years of lifting. I mean, for one, I would have been 16, but yeah.
But if you sound smart, like people will sign up with you. It's kind of that thing. I mean, the joke is, at least in the bodybuilding spaces, you've done one show and now you're an online coach, you're a posing coach, like you're all of that. So it's just as you said, as I get deeper into this field, the more I respect wisdom. And actually, this is a discussion you had with, I can't remember his name, but I was just listening to the podcast where I think he made a comment along the lines of teenagers now know more about hypertrophy training, I think, something along those lines, versus the bodybuilders however many years ago. And you were kind of like, I'm not sure about that. And I think that's that difference of when you're younger, you just don't have the wisdom to realize how much you don't know, and that Dunning-Kruger effect and the importance of experience and time in the game.
Yeah, and people don't realize how much of the education is practical. Like that you can't read about all the things that you need to know as a coach. Like you have to have both personal and coaching experience and stuff. And, of all the experiences, online coaching is probably the least bang for your buck in terms of, what you get out of it, because it's we'll say the most subjective and hardest to analyze. Like when you're working with people in person, you're getting a more intimate, approach to that, your biofeedback, your assessment and everything, your ability to control what you're doing is greater. Obviously, if you're working online, you can work with more people, but it's kind of like having more data points, but you're less sure about the data. And from a coaching perspective, it's almost like you already have to be a really good coach to be able to analyze your stuff as an online coach and improve from it. Like if you're not already doing a good job, the quality of data that you're probably looking at and the way you're assessing it and maybe even what you're collecting in general is probably not good enough for you to be making a lot of decisions off of, period, right? So it's kind of like, like how do I need the experience to get better, but but I want, so it's like, how do I get better if I need the experience to get better? And like, well, you have to start. But I think the journey starts with actually putting in the miles yourself, and then more intimate miles with fewer people. But I mean, so many of these people, they want to write an ebook or have 100 online clients before they've gotten, 2 or 3 years of training under their belt.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how it parallels to like competing, but there's people who want to step on stage after they've only been training for a year or two. And I'm like, oh man, like you're just not going to present anything particularly competitive after that period of time. You haven't even probably gone through any extensive cuts to have got particularly lean and at least lived that process a little bit. You're just gonna kind of, if you do get to stage, you're not going to present anything particularly impressive and something that you're going to be particularly happy about. Like invest a bit more time into just enjoying and growing in the gym.
The only people that really applies for are the people that look like bodybuilders before they started training, right?
Yes. Did you see? I've forgotten his name. He's a natural. He posed with Larry Wheels recently, and he just got drug tested with through Greg Doucette. I've forgotten his name, but an 18-year-old basically who's just like huge. I'm just like I'm never going to have. He has bigger arms than I have, and I've been doing this 2 decades, and arms are my strong point. It just is like okay, life isn't always fair, right?
Yeah, I mean now that fitness has become such a broader sport, and people are starting it earlier. It's amazing some of the young kids, but it's the same. Like if you looked at like a teenage Arnold or Jay Cutler or Lee Priest, like, I even know probably like one or two just from, growing up. Like there was this kid in middle school that had, biceps like a grown man, and in like 7th grade, he also had, I think, was like close to shaving by then. So, and it's like, okay, yeah, those genetics, that's a different world. Like if you want to know like who has a potential to be Mr. Olympia, like those are the kids, right? Like not the ones that still look like string beans, their freshman year of college or whatnot. So it's like, yeah, no, the guys that are hypertrophied playing video games, those are your potential Mr. Olympias, right?
That actually lines up really nicely to a quote I had from you. I found it on Threads. To quote you, you said, "Huge mistake made by coaches and their followers is assuming a training program that correlates with the hypertrophy results of someone with great genetics and anabolic use was a great program. In reality, all we can say is the program didn't stop the person from making progress." As almost what we're kind of talking about in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, when you're that gifted, essentially, and this even applies for performance sports, essentially, sometimes the coaching process is like, just don't get in the person's way, right? Like you're mitigating setbacks more than you're trying to optimize, because it's like, what can you really optimize when somebody responds that well? Like, when people ask me like, hey, if Ronnie Coleman trained, with N1 stuff, could he be bigger? And I'm like, I don't know, because I don't know if anything in my toolbox can have a perceptible difference relative to just how good of a responder he is and all of the other things that he were taking. Like I don't have a variation of a bicep curl that is better than steroids. Like that's just the way it is. Okay. Unfortunately, that's never going to exist,
And it's even to the point, and it's so well said actually, like, don't get in their way, because a lot of the things that we might apply as coaches or people who keep a drift of the evidence is the average responder. Like a lot of people who come for coaching aren't genetic freaks and amazing. A lot of the research just gives you the average responder. But if you have someone like a Ronnie Coleman, they're literally a freak. It's like, Ronnie, you might actually know intuitively what to do better than anything I could try and work out. It's hard to actually know at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. An interesting like element of that is you see some people and they're really good responders. And I think a mistake some people make is like, well, since they respond so well, why don't we just keep doing more and more because they seem to be able to recover or benefit. And I've seen some people with great genetics or good recovery capacity, and what they do is instead of like kind of taking advantage of how that allows them to be very efficient in their progress, they end up pushing so hard that they actually end up getting injured or having health problems because it's like, okay, cool. This person seems to benefit from or still be able to benefit from like this incredibly grueling training. Doesn't mean it's the best or optimal or that other things won't start to fail along the end or they'll just completely burn out and stuff. And you can probably like, you can think of some bodybuilders that have been extremely successful but are well kind of branded as lazy and stuff. And I'm like, well, maybe there's something to be said where if those guys can grow so much from so little, it doesn't necessarily mean that more is better. But I think a lot of people, they're just, oh, if I'm growing twice as fast here, why don't I push a little bit more, push a little bit more, push a little bit more? And eventually what you do is you essentially burn out the gifts that person had, you
Yeah.
you accumulate so much fatigue or injuries and setbacks and stuff that you take that potential and this is like, that would be an example of like actually getting in their way, rather than just letting kind of their potential express itself with a more, we'll say, appropriate level of training volume and effort, right?
For sure. Yeah, it makes me think of I've seen people critique like a Usain Bolt, his like gait and the way he runs. It's like, man, he's literally the fastest man on the planet. Like I don't know if we can really critique him there. I think there's a reason he's moving that way. But this does lead me to another question for you, Kaz, was there's something we spoke about in the past was talking about some of the data on length and partials and how bodybuilders almost kind of intuitively worked around this without maybe always doing partials, but maybe on their rowing patterns, their pulling patterns, they would use some momentum to help get it short. So that incongruent kind of strength to resistance profile of the muscle versus kind of where they'd fail, they could actually take the muscle closer to muscular failure by using some momentum to keep getting those short reps where inevitably they would fail first. Is there anything else you're seeing within kind of, I don't know, elite bodybuilders or in that space where people kind of do stuff intuitively correctly, but maybe hasn't been refined or looked at within research just yet? Or other examples that come to mind?
Um, it's hard to say if I'm trying to generalize all of bodybuilding because there's so much individual variation in response, but I would say like you can look at how a lot of these guys trained and everything from the exercise selection to the volume that they're doing, the rep ranges they're working in, they're applying some intuition to kind of all of that stuff. And you will have some people that thrived with lower volume, some people that thrived with higher volume, and different rep ranges, etc. But I think the bodybuilders that were doing the best job of kind of applying the scientific method to themselves kind of they kind of looked at everything kind of, we'll say, one off, meaning that like, okay, they evaluate this exercise on its own and the rep range for that and how many sets they can tolerate. Like they were just good at kind of figuring out, all right, what are the exercises that seem to kind of work for me, and then what levers can I pull with this? And they weren't like super attached, like, you know I don't I don't think, rep range was such a tribal thing back then. It was just like, hey, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And people would vary stuff more often, but also they would just kind of go with kind of what felt good for the exercise. And that's basically my primary suggestion on that. Regardless of all the research, it's like, well, you know what? We can talk about rep range in principle, but the exercise is such a huge variable in that, and that, yeah, I'm not going to treat a squat like a calf race. Just, in terms of how I approach tempo, rep range, volume, proximity to failure, all of those things. I'm going to look at that kind of specific to an exercise and within a program as a whole. And I think that's probably a big thing that they all kind of did, is that the intuitive bodybuilders didn't apply rules. They took some principles and then kind of took it like each exercise. They kind of was like, all right, here's this tool. If it's a good tool for me, I'm going to use it in the way that kind of seems to work well for me,
Yeah, and I think that's so well said. And I think it's hard to develop actually coming back to only being in the gym a couple of years. You haven't got that skill set yet, have you? You haven't got that ability to really connect with your body and what kind of feels right, what doesn't. And that's fine. And when you first start out, training programs are actually your best thing to follow, like a carbon copy training program, better than you
Mhm.
making something up because you ain't got a clue. But once you've learned your body, what you respond well to, how much volume you can handle, now you can start individualizing the program to yourself. So actually, I guess it makes sense why, if people are so new to this thing, that they are just then parroting things they've heard because they don't know any better. Because they're like, hey, I haven't got the experience to understand that high reps sometimes actually work better for some people in some contexts for some exercises.
Mhm. Yeah, patience is definitely not a strong virtue in bodybuilding or fitness right now. And if anything, I think that's probably another thing you could say is I don't think I don't think bodybuilders of the past were in such a rush. I think they respected like this was a process, and there wasn't this urge to do extreme things or to just drastically change what they're doing because they just wanted to get that progress that much faster. I think applying the scientific method to your own training back then wasn't as much of a choice because you just didn't have access to enough external information. You kind of had to just kind of figure it out. You had to apply the, FAFO, protocol. And now I think, there's the temptation to try to forgo that and rely too much on external information and just not try to learn how to listen to your body, how to evaluate exercises, and respecting that, look, if you train for 2 years, there's only so many protocols you could have done. There's only so many exercises that you could have tried, right? And, you only have so much of a skill set to evaluate that, so there's just time is something that can't be replaced. You can't do twice as many different programs in 2 years as somebody else just to be able to learn that because you won't have given those things enough time to really evaluate how those things work. Same thing for an exercise. You can't just be like, well, okay, I'm just going to do all the exercises now so that I can know, like, you're not going to spend the time getting good enough at them, and you're not going to know how to evaluate them or actually take enough time to see if they led to any difference in progress without the time. You can't overcome time with reading about things or changing things too often, etc. There's like just a certain time threshold that you have to respect to be able to learn things. And I think if you try and skip that, you might actually be setting yourself back on the learning curve because now you're going to have to go back and spend that time again and then some because you didn't spend enough time the first time actually seeing how this exercise or this protocol worked for you.
Yeah, it's really well said. I've thoughts just fumbling around my head. One thought that's just come into my mind was the discussion. First of all, you mentioned the fatigue as a bogeyman at the moment. It's like people are leaning too far into like worrying about fatigue, which makes me think of the principle of SFR, stimulus to fatigue ratio for exercises. And I think it's a great principle, but it can be wrongly applied because stimulus is fatiguing. Like you can't
Mm-hmm.
get stimulus without fatigue. So I'm always like, if it's a high stimulus, it's probably quite fatiguing. So you have to like recognize you can't have no fatigue. It's that unwanted fatigue that people need to focus on in terms of like joint connective tissue, pain, that sort of thing. And it also brings up someone who comes to mind is Jordan Peters, who I know you've had various interactions with. I think he likes a lot of the content that you put out and has learned a lot from you. And I don't know if you saw his post that went pretty viral, which was like basically just been like, guys, stop screaming and shouting about fatigue when you're still in your diapers type of thing. And he regularly gets frustrated at social media and where it is right now. And I don't think he was, I certainly think if you were to sit him down and have a long format conversation, he'd be like, yeah, of course fatigue is important and you've got to manage it, but only when it starts to become like a bottleneck to you.
Yep.
When you're new and just getting into the gym, it's not such a big deal. But you have people who will, and that obviously came about where people be like, oh, I've trained for 3 weeks, I must deload week 4 because, I don't know, they heard it somewhere on the internet. It's like, oh, people aren't listening to their body at all.
Yeah, too much fatigue going around right
Yes.
now, you know.
Yeah, it's trying to distill. And then if people are listening and they're like, man, I just feel lost with this conversation or where you're going and what have you, I'm always like, draw it back to the big principles. So something like going just to an Eric Helms muscle and strength pyramid, pick one of those up, read it through, and that'll just set you up so well. Because I think that is where people miss the forest for the trees, and they just get
Yep.
caught up in all of these really nuanced discussions a lot of the time. Like rep
hmm
ranges ultimately is a relatively nuanced discussion. Like it's not like a make or break thing.
It's one of those things where people are, you might be discussing a topic and you might be factually correct in some context, but something can be like factually true while also being irrelevant. So like we can talk about a mechanism and be like, hey, here's a mechanism and this is how this happens, which means that, if you did rep range 1 and rep range 2 today and they were both novel, then rep range 2, which was higher, would produce more fatigue. But is that fatigue actually relevant to the next section or to the next session, right? And does that still matter once you have 2 or 3 weeks of the repeated bout effect? And is that fatigue completely negative, or is that actually what stimulates the adaptions for you to be more fatigue resistant? So there's a lot of these scenarios where you can say a statement that isn't necessarily false, but we'll say what you're trying to give away as the message is misleading, because it's like, okay, here's the thing, it's true, but it matters not at all. Stability is a great one, or a great example, I think, that I've seen with this is, people are like, okay, if an exercise is more stable, I should be able to generate more force and get more motor recruitment. And yeah, if we're talking about like, hey, should you do like cable rows standing on one foot in front of the machine, type of thing? Absolutely not. But do you need to go down the process of trying to eliminate any stabilization demand and isolating just one joint, etc.? And we're talking probably way beyond the point where there would be any differences outside of doing like a maximum isometric that you could even measure a potential difference, and that still probably wouldn't correlate to any measurable difference in hypertrophy. So people are, it's like you've already gotten a stable enough exercise, and now we're just trying to find ways to make the exercise more stable, to apply the principle of stability beyond the point where it has any utility, and I just think that that's a good example for what's being applied for all of these individual mechanisms, when it comes to fatigue or motor unit recruitment, et cetera, is that people are like, okay, well, here's a mechanism. And rather than understanding kind of how this principle actually applies and when there's the point of diminishing returns, I'm just going to take it to the most extreme that I can get. And I think that's ultimately how we got into people focusing on fatigue, when it's like you're so far away from a training system where fatigue should be, something that you're worrying about, that like, right, you've basically programmed yourself into just undertraining, and that's why it's kind of like people are like, oh, you're scared of fatigue. And other people are like, no, it's fatigue management. And I'm like, well, you are now micromanaging this, well, like to the point where you've actually kind of working backwards, right? You're spending more time on the management than the production of the mechanical tension at this point in time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so well said. Actually, weirdly enough, and actually, people use this as a analogy often in terms of, it was something we were talking about off air. I was talking about my tattoo and recovering. You were saying, hey, you just got burnt. And you were surprised because you kind of had acclimatized to being able to handle that kind of heat and things. But you're at a new elevation. There was some novelty, some difference, and you weren't. And there was some like breeze, and the conditions were different. So you weren't kind of able to use biofeedback to kind of be like, hey, I've probably been out here too long, and you got burnt. It's like, what this makes me think of is people putting on like factor 50 all the time, or they're just like fully clothed and they're like keeping themselves undercover and like, the sun's terrible for me, I'm going to burn. And then as soon as, I don't know, they forget to put it on one day, or they mix up their I'm going to say toothpaste with their sunscreen, and they go out and they're like sizzling and they're burnt to a crisp. It's like, yeah, I mean, that's the problem. Like the body is adaptable, it's resilient, and you want to encourage that process. So yeah, I think that's very well said, Kassem. Have you got anything on that, or can I flip the script a little bit?
Go ahead.
Cool. So I have no doubt you've heard of this. It's only something I've heard of more recently. It's probably been going around for ages. You probably had this critique on you and N1 countless times, I imagine. And this is kind of called using dead guy anatomy. So using kind of a skeletal model, bands, to kind of give various rationales for a variety of biomechanics and kind of explaining, okay, moment arms and leverage and these sort of things. Is there any basis for this critique? And how? What are the limitations of using kind of a skeletal model and bands? What's your perspective here?
Well, a lot of times when people are critiquing a model, it's usually like no models are perfect, but usually there's a disconnect between what the model is meant for and what their expectations are of the model. You know, having bands on a skeleton can be used largely as a visual, but it's not actually too dissimilar to the way they calculate moment arms in a lot of studies that people reference. Like the bands, if you like let's take a study that is meant to investigate moment arms in a laboratory setting. What they'll do is they will actually pull the muscles off, and then they will anchor like it's like fishing line or wire to the insertion and origin points of those muscles. And then they will either find the axis and measure the moment arms there, or what they'll do is they'll run that line through another pulley system. And what they'll do is they'll move the joint and they'll measure how much distance is changed as the joint moves, and they'll measure the moment arm that way, right? And so when we're throwing bands on a skeleton, it's not like we're trying to do an in-depth research study. But we can do is we can show the relationship of like, hey, here's the line of action of this muscle. We can see leverage increasing, decreasing. We can show a lot of things that you can't get out of a research study. Like if I'm showing the biceps when I'm just demoing it with the skeleton with some bands, I can show how the biceps would change if there was a larger brachialis sitting underneath it, or if somebody had a more distal or proximal attachment. So you can show a lot of these things principally. I can show the relationship between different muscles. Now, when you get to a certain level of nuance, actually none of our models are that good. Like even the most advanced models we have are estimations built on estimations built on estimations. And this is actually something that, kind of came up in my recent lat debate, is there was just a complete misunderstanding of kind of what drawing maybe a simple moment arm on a anatomy picture is versus running a computation model where it's trying to account for all of the forces going on. And maybe that model is trying to be validated with EMG, meaning that basically they're saying, hey, is the math right? And they're basing it off of EMG. And we know that's a limited proxy in general there. And so there's this kind of like, if you throw these things on a hierarchy, you end up making a lot of mistakes of assuming that like, well, okay, this is the good information and this is the bad information. It's like, hey, does a model serve the purpose of what you're trying to communicate? And so if you just throw some bands on a skeleton and you're trying to do some very accurate science, maybe that's not the appropriate application. But if you're trying to show some general, hey, here's how a muscle acts, here you can see the joints it's crossing and kind of how it functions, those type of things are amazing tools. I think a lot of times it's actually the people that don't have a very good foundational understanding of biomechanics that tend to be dismissive of those things because they don't understand enough to be able to utilize that model. But maybe they've read a study where they can say, hey, look, they found this or that or the other, or they're talking about something different. Like I've heard some of the weirdest claims like, hey, bands on a skeleton don't account for muscle volume. And I'm like, yeah, what does? Right? What current modeling system do we have that accounts for muscle volume? Because at least with bands, you know what I can do? I can move the band to illustrate how changing muscle volume would impact that line of action. If I'm modeling this stuff in OpenSim or something like that, like cool, like I can build a little sphere ball and stick it under the glutes to kind of like make them wrap like they're supposed to. But that I can do the same thing, sticking my hand under a band and pulling it out and kind of showing how that changes, right? So like it's just all sorts of weird stuff. Or like bands don't account for motor recruitment, and I'm like, well, no, of course they don't, right? But neither does any other study on leverage. That this is like, okay, that there's no motor unit recruitment data that tells you what the leverage is or is not. And so I see a lot of these critiques where it's like they're just saying that's not the whole picture. And I'm like, well, nobody's arguing that like, hey, I can teach you everything about hypertrophy with a skeleton and some bands. But that tends to be the criticism, and it usually comes from people that just don't understand what's trying to be communicated here, because most people don't actually have any, we'll say, foundational biomechanics education, especially in the context of resistance training. Like even if like you get a PhD in biomechanics at university, you might have very little education that's contextually relevant to resistance training, and that's just the reality of it. So my answer is that I just find most of those criticisms funny. That being said, there are people that misuse models all the time. So they'll throw a string on something or whatever, and they will make claims that they shouldn't be based off of what they're doing, right? Or they're putting bands on a skeleton and forgetting about like, hey, here's the other 10 things that you need to consider, for this topic as well. So there's definitely people that misuse models, but that's not the model's fault. That's, the practitioner.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Where it's like you mentioned, there's lots of models and proxies that we can use, such as EMG. I know you are very aware of the limitations of EMG, and many of the listeners will be. I did a whole podcast with Alan Bacon on it, but that doesn't mean you can just completely disregard it. Maybe there's some upsides there, and you can use it in and amongst some other models or proxies to give you an assessment tool. I think it's kind of similar to people, I don't know, dismiss completely the pump or sauna completely, and I'm like, I mean, you could have that position and you could make an argument for it, but I don't think that's probably the best position to have. You just have to understand how you're applying it and understand the limitations of it too. So I think that's essentially what you're saying here with the bands. But unfortunately, people over-index on things like Arnie with the pump, right?
Yeah. Well, I just think it's funny because people will criticize, like, they're like, oh, this way that you modeled this thing is not good. You need to do it this way. And it will be a person that also basically criticizes EMG, but the thing they're asking for is a model that is validated by using EMG. So it's like, I don't know, like you're being very inconsistent in your logic here is you're saying, hey, I don't understand this well enough, so I'm not going to accept that, but I'll accept this other form of information that's actually validated using a proxy that I don't believe in. And you just see a lot of that where people are just kind of moving the goalpost or saying, hey, that's not good. I want this, and not even understanding what they're asking, right? Like in the debate I had on lats, I just found it so funny that the standard of what was being asked of me was basically, it's like, okay, so what you want me to do is basically do the most complex computation model on the shoulder and torso that's ever been done, just to say like, yeah, the lats can pull the shoulder down also, it's like, come on.
Yes, too much. And that's where those sort of debates start to become. I think that's where people get frustrated. Even obviously you're getting frustrated with it, but people get a bit frustrated because it gets too nuanced, too unpractical, too lost into the weeds of things that ultimately maybe don't serve us all that well. Which is
especially when you have people that they're asking for a level of nuance that they don't understand, because then the conversation can't even really go anywhere if you were to try and cover or explain that nuance,
Yeah. We've spoken about lats, and I think you probably are fed up with the lats, but something I've seen a resurgence of is talking about training the chest. And something I think I came across your content a long time ago, and it reminds me of, it was a little bit similar to when I first came across, I think it was Alan Aragon, and he was talking about if it fits your macros. And I was like, no, clean eating is the way. Screw you, Alan. The macros can't be the way. And then I started learning more and trying some things out, and I benefited from that. similarly with your content, I think I saw something along the lines of basically saying, hey, a harsh retraction of the scapula and like a powerlifting arch might not be ideal for hypertrophy. And there's some discussion around kind of the impact of the rib cage on kind of biomechanics and how you should execute movements for the chest. I'd love to just hear where you are right now with kind of your chest training in regards to like rib cage, arching, retraction, scapula, that sort of thing.
Yep. So you can think of the rib cage as it's basically a giant pulley, for your pecs and your lats and your upper back to pull the arms around, right? And there's lots of ways you can leverage it. I think right now, there's people that have a model, they refer to it as like a compression expansion model or something like that. And it's based on a system that's built off of breath mechanics. And I think the biggest mistake they make when they're applying it to training is the assumption that basically we should train around our breathing mechanics, when in reality, our breath mechanics are meant to adapt to the positions and load that our body is in, right? So like we have like an asymmetrical diaphragm. So like when we run and stuff, we're meant to be able to breathe a little bit more out of one side than the other as we go through our gait motion, or a little bit more through the anterior versus the posterior, compartment. So same thing with resistance training. Like if I'm doing a single arm row or a press or something, I'm meant to be able to breathe in the orientation that I need to be able to produce that force. So in terms of like, should you arch or should you not arch? The answer is like, well, it just depends. Arching is something that you can do to just change that kind of the orientation of those muscles relative to the position that you're trying to push. So it's like, okay, if I arch more, can I get more lower chest in an exercise? Or if I arch more, does that actually allow me to get more scapular motion on, because basically I'm putting my traps up on the bench rather than being flat on the bench? Like those are all applications for arching. Obviously, if we're doing motions like, like a cable press around, or, cable flies and stuff like that, where there's nothing on our back, then we don't have the bench component, but we do still have like, okay, opening and closing the rib cage, extending and flexing it can kind of change orientation. Now, with some of these tools where people will be like, okay, if I'm arched, maybe I got a shoulder problem or something like that, and when I compress, it feels better. It's not necessarily that arching is bad or arching causes dysfunction. And I think that's where people kind of screw up, is they think the mechanism is like, oh, okay, if I use a more, expanded rib cage, or, which is basically the equivalent of like contracting the abs down, like, think of it as like from a bodybuilding perspective, it would be like pulling the waist in, or cinching a little bit in that position, like, oh, then my shoulder doesn't hurt. And it's not necessarily that the extension itself was bad. It's simply that you were probably compensating in some way in one position. And if we move you into a different position, it doesn't put you into that position where you have to compensate. So a thing that commonly gets said is like, well, okay, if you're expanded, the scapula can move, but if you're compressed, it can't move as much. And the reality is like, well, no, the scap can move in both. It moves slightly different because the rib cage is in a slightly different position. So the scap is still moving. It's just moving on a slightly different thing. So it's simply about matching the rib cage, the arm path, etc., all up in your setup so that it's basically it suits your anatomy for the exercise and the force that you're trying to do. And there are going to be situations where people get in where they have limited mobility in one position of orientation, and changing the orientation of the rib cage might provide relief, but it doesn't necessarily fix the problem. Some people, it's like, okay, if I train this way with a not extending the rib cage, if I train that way for a while, then the pain goes away. And well, did using a different rib cage position fix that, or did simply just avoiding the thing that was causing pain for a period of time fix that? Because you can get a lot of the same, we'll say, benefits or fixes by simply working on mobility directly at the arm, or working on actually just the abdominal muscles, etc. So I think there's a big discrepancy between, oh, rib flare is bad when or versus like actually when you're flaring your ribs as a compensation because you're doing it because you don't have the mobility. So if I don't have the mobility at the shoulder, I'm arching because I've ran out of mobility. That's a different situation than, hey, I have the mobility, I'm arching to be able to line up the portion of the pec that I want to, to train, and I have a stable rib cage because my abdominals are in control here, etc. That's very different than when you're compensating with extra arch or extra flare, etc. And you just can't apply the mechanism of like, well, in this complex system, the problem must be that the rib cage was too compressed or expanded. Well, that's one variable in this kinetic chain, right? And a lot of times there's multiple solutions that are either temporary workarounds and long-term fixes. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes there's not. And I think if I'm understanding probably the content of where you're coming from, the biggest mistake I think is thinking that like, okay, we can't use the extension and there's only one way to utilize the rib cage. And to me, that's not true at all. There's positions where people are going to be uncomfortable in both orientations of the rib cage, and they're going to be limited in different movements or different ranges of motion depending on where they go. There isn't one rib cage position that's best for pecs. And, a lot of it has to do with how good you are at engaging your abdominals in those positions. So to me, like if you have, we'll say, good trunk motion and actually do some abdominal work, the odds that you're going to have issues relative to stabilizing the rib cage are going to be much smaller, right? But if you never do any spinal motion, you never do anything where you're actually opening and closing, well, then yeah, you might get into the position where eventually it's like, okay, I lost a little mobility in my shoulder because probably haven't been doing, full range of motion for that either. Is that you essentially get to a point where it's like, okay, now I have to kind of do some weird positioning with my body to fit this exercise, and it's maybe not going to feel the best, especially if I load it heavy or do it for a long period of time.
Yeah, I think that was well explained. And yeah, I mean, I might actually have to bring Jonathan Warren is someone who has been talking about this a lot, of course, and he recently critiqued Joe, the hypertrophy coach, who Joe Bennett's been on the show several times. And yeah, there's been some back and forths and content around that. And I think what you brought to the discussion there was nice in terms of, I think Jonathan actually, when I hear him speaking, sometimes he sounds a little bit black and white in some of his language and like maybe a bit too blunt in some of his terminology. And I think some people like that, and that's why it kind of gets attention. But I think if you were to dig into him a little bit more, there's more nuance to his discussion and his position in terms of like, it's not just like fully protraction and there's no time for like any sort of arching. And when I come back to some of the discussion we've had here, clearly there's people that have found that kind of model and understanding of things to have really helped their chest training. But quite clearly, people have been doing it more, I guess, the traditional way of slightly more arched, generally retracting. And there's powerlifters who have not had huge issues and developed great chests that way. And it's kind of like we come back to that bro experience, learn your body type of thing and feel things out. And I think that is something that sometimes can't be explained by models all the time.
A good analogy, for this is the strength and flexibility component. Like you can't be your strongest and your most flexible at the same time. You're either trying to have your tissue be a little bit more rigid so it's going to be explosive and good for power, or you're trying to have your tissue basically be a little bit more pliable or malleable so that like you can get a little bit more mobility. Same thing here. It's like when you're talking about like, okay, people adapt to having a more flared rib cage and not or whatever. It's just like, okay, there's going to be certain adaptations that your body makes posturally and structurally based off of kind of the performance demands you're asking for it. And if you steel man the case here of like some of the utility of this is like, hey, you can funnel yourself into a performance goal so much that you start to become dysfunctional in too many other things, right? Especially for hypertrophy training, because like performance is not the goal, but potentially you could be doing all of your exercises in one posture or one position, or your exercise selection could be very biased to certain things and you're neglecting other things. And then there's like, yeah, you know what? Maybe I need to include some exercises that like kind of load the opposite end of the chain or force me into different postures, etc., to kind of balance that out. Because what that's going to do is it's going to improve my overall function, because I've just been too specialized in these other positions. For hypertrophy training, you don't have to be that specialized, because it's not about your PR and bench press, right? It's about being able to basically train your chest in with a decent amount of effort and volume from the variety of positions that kind of suit your aesthetic goals, you know? So you don't want to be in a position where it's just like, hey, I can't do anything at an incline because that hurts now if upper chest is your primary goal. So, so you may need to do some things that are actually going to help with your scapular motion, your external rotation, etc. And, some oblique training and stuff like that might be part of that.
It makes me think of what you became very popular for in the bodybuilding space is the iliac lats, right? The lower lats, and targeting those, because you saw that a lot of bodybuilders lacked that area in terms of muscularity. And it's similar here. It's like if you don't train a function, or if you don't work a function, then it can lead to, well, underdevelopment of that. And so that might be something you then want to focus on. So yeah, for me with technique, I come back to just some of the basics of like pain-free. You want to be strong, in control. You want to feel it in the target muscles, taken through a decent stretch. It doesn't have to be maximized stretch. You might play around with that, and make sure the target muscle is the limiting factor, not stability, breathing, other muscles, and progress with that. And that can look a variety of different ways. And you might learn that allowing your scapulars to free up a bit, which I learned, allowing them to free up a bit and not being as rigid about like having a powerlifter arch, actually ended up making me feel better overall. But if you're progressing a movement in a pain-free, safe way, and it's like a basic movement, it's going to be growing something. Nice.
Yeah, one
Kassem,
thing I definitely haven't changed my mind on is that you should let your scapula move as you're pressing. And I think the easiest way to kind of address that logic is you wouldn't hold protraction while doing a row, right? Like, so why would we not let the pecs do one of their primary functions, which is to, protract at the sternoclavicular joint, like during that motion? It doesn't mean that your goal should to be do like a push-up plus type motion. Usually what I tell people is like, hey, just focus on not restricting the scapula and focusing on your upper arm path, and let your subconscious nervous system manage the scapular humeral rhythm and the amount of protraction relative to shoulder adduction flexion that you're doing. And usually if you can cue people to have a good arm path, then the scapular kinetics just kind of work themselves out. We'll say like the majority of the time, I don't ever have to cue people to do anything specific in terms of trying to move their scapula, if I just simply do a good job on helping cue their arm path, and maybe their intention of what they're pushing and pulling on.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. The issue I see with people is when they have that very rigid, I must be retracted throughout the entire range of motion and arched, and then it's just like an awkward press. Whereas it's exactly as you said, generally it just kind of takes care of itself. And when I thought about it after I'd kind of read your content and I was thinking about it a bit more and I was pressing, I was like, oh, my scapula aren't all the way retracted. They are just kind of moving freely. Of course, they're not protracted or rounding over here, and it's causing me pain in my shoulders. But that's when I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's when I'm failing. That's when I stop the set. So yeah, that's really nice. Kassem, one final question if you have time. Well, I think you have time for it. So I'm going to ask this final question here. Is there anything you look back within your whole career as anything that comes to mind as, I'm going to call them failures or lessons or things you felt like you got wrong? Is there anything you regret? Is there anything you learned from some of those things?
I would say that like the biggest setback in my approach to training was a period where I got too focused on intention, right? So think of like taking the mind muscle connection thing like to an extreme, where a lot of what we were doing was cueing people like, okay, hey, here's how to contract the muscle and whatnot. and not focusing on basically trying to set the exercise up so well that you didn't have to think. I think that was the biggest shift from where I previously was, and what kind of led me to go the direction of creating N1 was there's like intention based training kind of was something that came around in the same camp of when I first started kind of digging into the physics stuff and applying that more in resistance training. Um, and you can definitely make people feel things. But that was like the period of time where I'm like, okay, I have people that are just like shaking and sweating bullets doing this stuff, and they're really feeling it, but not really progressing it from a load perspective or from a physique perspective like I used to. And, um, you know, the idea is like, hey, the nervous system controls the muscle. If we can just get the intention there, we're going to get the motor recruitment. And like that only works to a certain degree where you can't be using too much weight and it can't be too close to failure, which if we're talking about hypertrophy, it's with enough loading close enough to failure. Like those are the conditions that we want. Um, so that was probably the biggest mistake that I made was kind of focusing too much on intention and utilizing cues. And part of that probably was just kind of the influences that I had at the time, but also kind of the addiction to the instant feedback that you can get from people. Like if you give people a good cue or whatever, that instant change in sensation, they think you're this wizard. And sometimes if you just focus on, hey, we're going to set this exercise up and then I'm going to let your body figure it out. You could be like, hey, why don't I try and like give these cues and stuff to make them figure it out right away? Or maybe I just set them up and let the resistance and the reps start educating the body so that then we have competency without having to figure it out. Um, that doesn't have that like instantaneous, like, okay, now I really feel my lats. But did they really feel their lats because they were doing the exercise properly, or because they were just posing their lats because I gave them a cue to pose their lats? Because that's essentially what intention training is doing, is you're applying a pose that isn't required by the exercise. You're basically having them add to the contraction an element that the resistance and the exercise vector, etc., wouldn't otherwise ask of them. And basically, that's when I really kind of decided that I was going to absolutely master mechanics to the level that I could get people to do whatever I needed them to do in the gym without having to give them like a single cue or as few cues as possible, and one that put me in more control because cues are subjective. But, it also just provided significantly better results and more consistent as well.
I think that's a really good take home, because I do see people, you see them in the gym all the time where they are like really focusing on a muscle, and you'd never see their reps slow down, so on and so forth, because it's just as you say, when you are getting close to failure, the body's just going to utilize everything to kind of take you there. So you're better off, just like you said, focusing more on that external factors and how they're moving versus just this over focus on internal, especially feeling it during the exercise itself. I find that can definitely take you in the wrong direction. So yeah, lovely, Kassem. Thank you so much for your time. Are you up to anything yourself? I think I've had some emails from you that your app is now live and people can start, I think, a free trial on that as well. Have you got anything else cooking?
Yeah, so the app is a big thing. I think it's actually, we're like 5 years into development of it right now. Um, it's not it's not just a logbook. It's basically N1 in your phone, if you will, in terms of not just our exercise library, but think of it this way: is we're utilizing this as a way that will eventually, it'll be the biggest research project that we can have, where we're actually utilizing people's data in there to inform them of the types of training that are working better for them or the community in general, etc., and all sorts of different, we'll say, correlations between the feedback and progress that people make relative to the training variables. And you can even utilize it as a way of kind of, we'll say, if you're neglecting a muscle, over time. Like it'll be like, hey, you haven't trained this muscle in this range of motion in 6 months. Is that on purpose
Interesting.
or is that on accident? So that's the biggest thing. I am actually doing some live mentorships starting I think at the end of July is going to be one for programming. So it's it's the first time I'm going to try and deliver kind of what we do in person in a virtual format. And so we're starting with programming because that's easier, because it's easier to kind of go through that, but so that people can actually workshop that stuff instead of just lecture and kind of ask questions and stuff. But we're also probably in quarter 3 going to do our first attempt at a virtual practical of biomechanics. So here's
Wow.
the technology allows us to basically do a really good job of analyzing people's technique and giving them feedback virtually rather than me being able to just grab their arm and move a pulley, in person. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But for anybody that hasn't been able to physically make it to Colorado, those are two things that you can be looking for. But our schedule is open. So my best suggestion is come to one of the seminars in Colorado.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll make sure I get the links from you, and I'll make sure the app's link there and all the mentorship and everything that you just mentioned there. That people can head and investigate and see if they want to get involved. I definitely think it's, as you said, as we were talking through, that one-on-one practical, yeah, you can't beat it. But eventually there'll be like AI assistant models that you can plug into, and you can control it from distance through webcams and manipulate someone. It's all
Yeah.
going to happen. I know it.
The question is, will that happen before people can just, take a pill and get all the benefits of
True.
exercise, right? Which
Very
will happen
true.
first.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that will probably happen first. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to
That'll sell
speculate.
better for sure.
Yeah. Kassem, thank you so much for your time. It's always a fantastic chat with yourself.
Yep.
I'll make sure all your Instagram as well as is linked below and your social media links. Thank you guys for listening. We'll catch you in the next one.
Always a pleasure, Steve.